And on behalf of education and research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to present the Industrial Hygiene webinar series. This collaborative effort is on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program and aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you for being here today. Today's webinar, School Bus Ventilation in the Context of COVID-19, is brought to you by the Mountain and Plains Education and Research Center at the Colorado School of Public Health and Dr. Mike Van Dyke. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You are muted during this presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the YouTube page. You'll receive a link to that recording once it's available. And all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation, and that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation form is completed, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our presenter for today, Dr. Mike Van Dyke. Dr. Van Dyke is an industrial hygienist, researcher, and public health practitioner and educator. Currently, he is associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health and the Center for Work, Health, and Environment at the Colorado School of Public Health. He has 20+ years of experience and has spent much time in the academic, community, clinical, and government levels. A common thread throughout his career has been a focus on the assessment and control of novel exposures and environments. These exposures have included occupational beryllium exposures among nuclear and aerospace workers, diactyl exposures, I'm probably saying that wrong, among flavoring workers, exposures to first responders from, another fun one, clandestine methamphetamine laboratories, illegal marijuana grow operations, and community exposures to oil and gas development. Hopefully I said those somewhat okay, Dr. Van Dyke. Thank you so much for being here today, and we're looking forward to the presentation.
Well, that is a tough act to follow. You have a great radio voice. Mine is not going to be nearly as good as that, but it is a pleasure to be here today to talk about some work that we've been doing at the Colorado School of Public Health in collaboration with folks at NIOSH. And today we're going to be talking about school bus ventilation, and really the impetus of this project was really around COVID. So hopefully you're not totally tired of COVID presentations just yet. So before we get started, I always like to put my collaborators and acknowledgements in the beginning. We couldn't have done this project without our collaborators, including Bradley King and Eric Eswine from NIOSH, and Michael Cosnett and John Adgate from the Colorado School of Public Health. And we wouldn't have had nearly as much fun riding around on buses if it weren't for the cooperation of Adams 12 School District. And, you know, all of us can't do this without funding. So thank you to CDC and NIOSH for the funding for this. So in terms of disclosure, keep in mind I am employed as an associate professor at the Colorado School of Public Health, and this work was funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. I don't have any other potential conflicts to report. So getting right into it, our overall goal for this study was to measure ventilation rates in school buses under realistic operating conditions, really in hopes to inform COVID-19 prevention guidance, not only for CDC, but for individual school districts as well. The main motivation from this when we started this project was really an article that was published in JAMA in June of 2020. And this was an article that talked about a community outbreak investigation of COVID among bus riders who were going to a worship event. And this was a paper where individuals were bused to a worship event. There were several buses that were used, and all the individuals went to the same worship event and also had lunch together. And when they analyzed this data, what they saw was the overall attack rate for all attendees in terms of COVID. I mean, there was an index case, was about 3%. So this is all the people who attended the worship event as well as the luncheon. About 3% of them got COVID. In contrast, the riders who were on the bus with the index case, about 34% of them got COVID. So this really suggested a high transmission on the bus. This was June of 2020. We were still talking about airborne transmission. The debate wasn't fully settled at that point. But if you look at the figure on the right there, there does seem to be some suggestion that, there is a higher risk for people sitting closer. In the analysis, those didn't quite come to statistical significance, but it was clear that riding on a bus can definitely be a potential exposure and a potential transmission route. Now, part two of the motivation is really that this is a large population that's potentially exposed. Every day, there are about 500,000 yellow school buses that get driven around. And that means that about 50% of all K through 12 students are transported by bus. This comes out to about 25 million children a day. And if you add up all the rides, it's about 10 billion annual rides. Now, this is a huge population at risk. And keeping in mind that a typical ride time on one of these buses for people who live in urban areas is somewhere around 30 minutes. However, folks who live in more rural areas can be on these buses far more than 60 minutes one way to get to school. So not only is it a large population, but it's a fairly significant exposure time as well. And this is one of the times when it's very difficult to use physical distancing, because that would require a lot more buses to really transport the same number of kids. And then finally, it is important to mention that there are definitely potential racial, ethnic, and income disparities in who actually rides school buses and uses bus transportation. Now, since we're doing work for NIOSH, another major part of our motivation was really thinking about bus drivers. And bus drivers spend more time on the bus. And if we look at how many bus drivers out there, there's about 700,000 school bus drivers. These folks work a split 6 to 8 hour shifts. And all of these folks have a commercial driver's license. Now, if you've looked in the paper, there's been tons of paper. If you've looked on the internet, I should say, there's been tons of articles about labor shortage issues in this particular industry. And anecdotally, in talking to school districts across Colorado, we heard a lot of school districts that had a major school bus driver shortage. And a lot of that was really due to these folks choosing to take a leave of absence during COVID to really minimize their exposure to COVID. And the reason for this is that bus drivers as a population are at increased risk for COVID. If we look at the demographics of bus drivers, we could say that more than 50% of these bus drivers are over 55 years old. Many of these are part-time workers, or they've retired from other industries or jobs. These folks work part-time and have limited access to benefits through this job. So this definitely puts them at an increased risk for COVID. And then finally, as we looked when we started this project, there was really a lack of detailed guidance for school buses. If we look at ASHRAE guidance is very general. Things like when conditions allow, make sure you open operable windows that will greatly increase the flow of air. If you look at what had been published on this in 2020, it really talked about that passive ventilation should be considered on a daily basis by the driver and transportation coordinator. Now, if we look at buses, there's a whole lot of options for passive ventilation in buses. And many of these options could make the interior of the bus really uncomfortable. So really thinking about what is the best guidance to really meet the requirement of maintaining a comfortable environment while increasing airflow to the extent necessary was really an important factor as we thought about doing this work. So before we get into the actual work, I want to make sure that we all understand what a school bus is like. Many of us rode school buses growing up. And from the outside, the school buses don't look very different than they did in the 70s and 80s, as far as I can tell. But just to get some terminology out there, This picture on the left here is a Type C school bus. This is the most common type of school bus in the United States. These buses, depending on how they're configured, seat between 70 to 90 passengers. They have a gross vehicle weight of more than 20,000 pounds. Now, we all look at these school buses and they kind of all look the same to us, but there are several different manufacturers that all have very similar designs. So there are very strict rules on how these buses are constructed, and there's very strict safety rules. So that's the reason many of them look the same. And essentially, there's little difference even between the manufacturers as well. When we start to look at how do you get ventilation, how do you get fresh air into a school bus, the first thing we want to talk about is active ventilation. So the only way that these school buses get fresh air into them through an active ventilation system is through this circled outside air intake on the bus. So the outside air flows into this intake through a fan and defrost unit that's in the dash, and all of that air gets blown against the windshield. So this is the way they can control fresh air. They can actually set it to fresh or recirculate. They have a multi-speed fan that controls how much air they're blowing on the windshield. And I will say that, when this thing is set on high, it's not a quiet fan. So it definitely can annoy the bus driver and definitely can interfere with their ability to hear students behind them. So all of the vents in this are directed at the windshield, and really the focus of this system is to make sure that you can defrost the windshield. In terms of most places, in the United States, air conditioning is a custom option on school buses. And in places like Colorado, no school buses have air conditioning. So, and then finally, the other way that they can actively push air through this bus is through the use of this bathroom type fan that's located in a hatch in the rear of the bus. And they can open this hatch and actively exhaust air using this hatch as well. So not a lot of options in terms of active ventilation. In terms of passive ventilation, there's a whole lot more options. For passive ventilation, you have a driver's window. It's usually a sliding window like this, as well as passenger windows next to every seat. Now, these passenger windows can be opened to different levels. Kind of the lowest setting is about 2 inches, all the way down to almost full open. And then in addition to the operable roof hatch in the back with the fan in it, there is an additional roof hatch that doesn't have a fan in the front of the bus. Now, keep in mind that these roof hatches can actually be pushed out, and they can be positioned in 2 different ways. The first way, think of it as kind of horizontal to the ground, so flat on top. And the other way is they could be angled towards the front or the back of the bus. And we kind of call that the scoop position later, so keep that in mind. And then there are other ways that air is recirculated in buses. And the main ways that this is done is mostly for heating purposes. There is a heating coil in the stairwell of the bus that has a fan in it that recirculates and heats air, as well as 2 to 4 under-seat heaters that look kind of like this picture on the top left. And, for all of us that rode buses, these were always the seats that we didn't want to sit in because it was like 150 degrees sitting in that seat. But these are essentially just heating coils with a blower, and they recirculate air in the bus. And then finally, there's a couple of fans. There's a couple of fans that are installed in the front of the bus. These are kind of pedestal-looking fans that are installed on the headboard. And these fans just circulate air and are really used to help defrost the front window of the bus. So now that we know what these buses look like and how they work, let's talk about what we did. So our main goal was to measure ventilation rates. So we wanted to measure air change rates. So the way we chose to measure air change rates in buses was to use a tracer decay method using carbon dioxide. Now, that's a pretty well-established method, been around a long time. And what we did is we injected we released food grade carbon dioxide up to about a 5,000 parts per million target concentration inside the bus. Once we released this CO2, we mixed inside this bus with a box fan, just to get everything well mixed and fairly uniform concentration. And then we started our air change measurement trial. And in order to measure the air change, we were measuring carbon dioxide at 1 second intervals using a TSI Q track. And each trial lasted between 5 and 30 minutes, depended on how high the air change rate was. In order to measure CO2, we measured at 7 different locations in the bus, including the driver's seat, front, middle, and rear of the bus. And as you can see over here, this is the way we were holding the TSI probes onto the bus. We were trying to simulate kind of breathing zone concentrations. And this at the top left here really shows us releasing CO2. And we had a manifold that we created with some Tygon tubing with holes all the way along it to really try to spread that CO2 all over the bus. So in order to calculate air change rates, for those of you who haven't done the tracer decay method, it's fairly simple. In order to calculate air change rates, we do a regression. We have the natural log of the CO2 concentrations in parts per million and the time in hours. We do a regression, and magically it turns out that the slope of that regression is actually the air change rate in hours. And as you can see here, we see a decay of the carbon dioxide concentration over time. And this is a pretty common example of what we saw of most of the sessions that we did. You get a really high R-squared value, a really strong regression, and pretty clearly showing about 2 air changes an hour in this particular example. In terms of the study design, remember our goal was to kind of inform evidence-based guidance for how to operate school buses to get a kind of an optimal air change rate while keeping the interior temperature fairly warm. So what we wanted to do is we looked at this both. We looked at it mobile, so that was riding the bus during a typical route. And then we also looked at it when the bus was stationary. So our first initial trials were really in a bus garage. We were just trying to see how these things functioned and what kind of air you could get into it when it was stationary. We had different variables that we explored. We explored different things with active ventilation, including trying the defrost on high or low. We used the hatch fan either closed, or we opened both hatch fans and put it on high. And then in terms of passive ventilation, we really wanted to see the effect of different configurations of windows open or closed. So with the driver's window, there were trials with it closed, trials with a little bit open, and trials with it full open. And then the same thing with passenger windows. And then in terms of the front roof hatch, we had it either closed, open flat, or open scoop. And then just to verify that, these recirculation fans didn't have an effect on the air change rates in the bus, we did test that with defrost assist fans on and off, as well as the underseat heaters on and off. So in terms of the results, and I realize there's a whole lot of information here, and I want to, I always like to see the results something like this, so I always try to present them like this. But I will definitely walk you through it. First of all, notice that if you look at the colors of the table, red is closed, green is fully open. So if you look at this table, as we go down the table, it really shows more opening of different windows and other things in the bus. So what we could see is that, Captain Obvious here, if you open more windows, you get a higher air exchange rate. The other thing that we could see is that if in a fully closed bus, we have a really low air change rate, about 0.1 air changes per hour, fully closed in a stationary position. As we open the windows, we get about a half an air change if we open them just a little bit. If we open the hatches, we also get about a half an air change. If we do things like turn the defrost on high, we start to see an air change of about 1. So, and then kind of moving down here, the more things we open, the higher the air changes that we get. But what's important here is, even with the defrost on high, the hatches open with the fan on, the driver windows and many of the windows open some, we're still only at about 4.7 air changes per hour. So it's really difficult to get much air into this bus when it's stationary, which makes sense. And this is going to change a lot once we go into a mobile phase. So in terms of the stationary findings, without open windows, hatches, or ventilation, this is a tightly sealed unit, about 0.1 air changes per hour. If we turn on the defrost, we can get up to about 1 air change an hour. If we open the hatch, we get up to about 1.8 air changes per hour. But frankly, when this bus is stationary, it's very difficult to get above 5 air changes per hour unless you open many of the windows widely. And then, the data is not shown, but as expected, really the air change rates didn't change when we turned on the defrost assist fans or the underseat heaters. So these things really do not affect air change rates. So in terms of mobile results, remember these results were obtained when we were riding the bus in mobile conditions. So essentially what happened was we would release the CO2 and then we would send the bus driver on a standardized route. And we would measure CO2 as he drove through a standardized route. This standardized route did include stops, and it was an actual bus route that was used at this particular school. So again, kind of the same thing showing here. As we move down the table, we are opening more of the windows and more of the hatches. So you see that a vastly increased air change rate as we move down the table. In contrast to what we saw in stationary conditions, where the air change rate was about 0.1 air changes per hour when it was fully closed, we saw about 1.9 air changes per hour when it was driving down the road. Now, what this says is, there are lots of holes and other things in the bus where fresh air enters as the bus drives down the road, which is not surprising. If we turn on the defroster, either on low or on high, we can get up to somewhere around 2.5 air changes per hour. And it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference whether it is on low or high. Now, if we open the hatches, that's when we start to see major increases in the airflow in the bus. So if we open both hatches and turn the hatch fan on, what we end up with is an air change of about 7.3 air changes per hour, which is a significant level of air changes. And then, as we move down the table here, if we add the defroster to the open hatches, we get up to about 9 air changes per hour. And then if we open the windows only a little bit, we get well above 12 air changes per hour with just a few openings in the bus. Now, I think the reason this is important is because we were really looking for kind of the optimal configuration to where we could make sure that the temperature stayed relatively comfortable inside the bus while we had kind of a maximum number of air changes. And what we found is we did much of this work in January during a snowy day where there was about 20 degrees outside. And under this condition where we had the defrost on low, the hatches open, and 6 windows open 2 inches, it remained relatively comfortable in the bus as long as we were wearing a light jacket. So this is definitely a doable condition under fairly cold conditions. Now, if we're talking somewhere like Alaska or Minnesota, this might not be doable, but for most of the country, we can definitely operate like this. And then, as we started to open windows more and more, it became more and more uncomfortable, but the air change rates did increase. So really what we found was without the defroster, open windows or hatches, we saw about 2 air changes per hour. The defroster alone really added little to the air exchange in the bus, only about a half an air change at best compared to no defroster. And then opening hatches is where we started to see the significant improvement in air exchange rate. And really what we found was optimally, if we think about putting the defroster on low and opening the hatches, we can clearly get above 9 air changes per hour. And if we add 6 slightly open windows, we could get above 12 air changes per hour. Importantly, as we experimented with different hatch positions, if we had it in the flat position versus the scoop position, it did not affect the air change rate much. It looked very similar regardless of what position the hatch was in. And then again, as with the stationary conditions, the underseat heaters and defrost assist fans really did little to affect the air change rate. So putting these results into perspective, we could see a chart here from a JAMA article that really shows the minimum required air change rate in different construction types. And what we could see is if we look at that, defrost on low and hatches open at about 6 air changes per hour, that's a much better air exchange rate than even what the minimum is required in classroom environments. And, if we start to see this 6 to 12 air changes per hour, we're really down into that area where we're talking about an emergency examination or treatment room with 6 air changes per hour, or even the 12 air changes per hour that you would expect in an airborne infection isolation room. So our feeling is that you can get a significant air exchange rate in these buses with a fairly minimal comfort cost. So in terms of practice recommendations, and these have been shared with CDC as well as folks at the school district, our practice recommendations are really that you operate buses with ceiling hatches open and the defroster fan on. And really to use the defroster on the maximum setting if the noise is not distracting, although there wasn't a huge difference between low and high, at least on the buses that we tested. And then weather permitting, opening windows as much as possible. And then finally, probably the most important piece of all of this is to make sure that drivers get educated on the effectiveness of each of the ventilation strategies and really understand the purpose of these things and making sure that you're really increasing air exchange rates in these buses. So with that, as always, ventilation is only part of the strategy. Ventilation is not going to help you prevent close range aerosol transmission or droplet transmission of COVID. These recommendations will definitely help dilute whatever contaminants are in the bus and really should be part of a layered approach to infection control for pandemic policies. So with that, that's all I have today. Questions?
Thank you so much for this very important research and also presentation. I personally have a family friend who is a retired bus driver. Well, they're retired and also a bus driver in their retirement. And I look forward to sharing these results with them. So thank you. We do have some questions. So at this time, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the online chat. The online Q&A. I prefer the questions in the Q&A if possible. It just helps keep better track of them for me. Our first question, were variables such as meteorological data, barometric pressure, humidity, etc. considered?
This was kind of a real world experiment. So we can only really do what the weather allowed us to do that particular day. We kept trying to find the coldest day that we could possibly do these things. And every time we were scheduled to do one of these things, it turned out to be one of those 50-degree days, except for that afternoon where, it was a typical Colorado, went from 70 degrees to 20 degrees in the matter of a day. So we weren't able to control those things. So we really didn't look at those things too much, though I'm not sure that, most of those would have a huge effect on the air change rate because most of this is outside air being forced in.
That actually ties directly into another question, is in thinking about the temperature difference, if the difference between the internal and external temperature would make any difference in air exchange rates.
I do. I think that's one of the biggest factors that we really weren't able to look at. I think one of the biggest factors that would really change this and make it more variable would be the heating of the bus, because that's going to cause a lot more convection and a lot more energetic airflows within the bus. So we weren't able to control those conditions, and we really wanted some practical advice for people. So it might affect it some, but I think any sort of heating would actually serve to increase the air exchange rate more than anything else.
you. And does the ventilation system design ensure fresh air and replacement air volume is equal or greater to the exhaust air volume?
This is not a very complicated system, so definitely not. It's how fast you go is going to affect how much ventilation you get in the bus. And, we were really trying to focus on a residential type route. So this wasn't a kind of rural style route where you're on a highway driving at high speeds. So no, there's no controls in the system other than opening the windows and opening the hatches.
Thank you. And with the under seat fans, are they all moving air in the same direction or are they adjustable?
I mean, they're all moving air in the same direction. I mean, they're taking air in from the top from the top and pushing it out the bottom. Now they are adjustable in terms of speed. I think there's a low, medium, and high setting. But other than that, there's not a lot of adjustability to them.
Thank you. Were there any strategies for which windows were open partially compared to where the floor heaters were in trying to balance the ventilation and the temperature?
We thought about that. But again, I mean, we had limited time with really this. We had to rely on the kindness of a bus driver to drive us around. So we did have some limited time. We thought about which windows should be open, and we kind of tried to make it so it would be easy to implement more than anything else. And when we thought about our windows, it's kind of one towards the front, one towards the middle, one towards the back, more of a convenience thing, thinking that that would kind of equally distribute how much air is going each direction. But no, we didn't really think about that. Now that might be an interesting thing to test in the future.
Thank you. We have lots of really great questions. So thank you everyone for putting your questions in the Q&A. Did the box fan remain on during the tests?
No, the box fan was only on, we used the box fan for probably a total of, 3 or 4 minutes to really mix the contents of the bus. And that was only because, we didn't try very hard to uniformly distribute the CO2 throughout the bus. So it was really to get those levels to a relatively uniform concentration from front to back.
Thank you. And can the hatches be open during the rain?
I think they can. And I think that, you can also, tilt them forward so you're not pushing air or you're not pushing rain into the bus. We were opening them when it was snowing outside and there was not snow coming into the bus. So we've definitely thought about that. And I think that is definitely a consideration. But in Colorado, it doesn't rain very often, so we don't worry about that.
I'm trying to think back to when I rode a bus in central New York where it rains like a third of the year. I feel like if it was your window, you wouldn't get the rain. If you were behind the person with the window open, that's when you got the rain. So you had to ask your neighbor in front.
We wanted to test it during rain just so we could see what happened, but we were not able to do that.
Thank you. Did you notice any significant differences in terms of where to sit on the bus, like in the front to the back?
We were really thinking we would see a big difference. But frankly, the results were consistent among every sampling location that we saw. So we kind of gave up on separating those out after we had 30 results when they were all the same. So there really wasn't a lot of difference.
Yeah. And this is kind of tied into a follow-up question. When the windows are completely closed, where would be the best place to sit? And would you say that was kind of a similar in all of your different testing scenarios?
Where's, people keep asking that, where is the best place to sit in the bus? That's hard to say. We really tried to do visual testing of the airflow patterns. I see that question as well, and it kind of feeds into that. And we did some visual testing of the airflow patterns when the bus was stationary. And what you could see is that when it was stationary, you really had a front to back flow. But at that point, air wasn't being forced into any of these openings. So for safety reasons, we chose not to fill the bus with smoke while the driver was trying to drive us around. But we really did want to look at visually what that looked like, but we weren't able to. So I think that probably the best place to sit is close to one of the window openings or close to the hatch opening, so the fresh air hits you first instead of being mixed with lots of COVID particles before it hits you later on in the bus.
I'd say that also ties in with one of your last slides, really acknowledging that it's not a one-stop shop in terms of ventilation or mitigation strategies, right? There's looking at the airborne contaminants in the ventilation, and then there's also masking and protection of if you're immediately next to someone, close matter, particulates, exposure, those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, clearly. I mean, it's only part of the strategy.
Mm-hmm. Was there any indication of introducing exhaust from the engine into the cabin with all the windows open?
So these particular buses that we were using, we were lucky. These were natural gas buses. So, these were not diesel buses where we would notice that sort of thing. I kind of wished we would have tried it with a diesel bus, so we would have kind of thought about that. But, I think the further you get away from the tailpipe, as long as you're moving, you're less likely to introduce exhaust from the bus. Now, in all of these situations, it's a question, right? What are the pollution levels outside, and do we want outside air inside? So I think it's a nuanced question, and it really depends on, are we worried more about air pollution, or are we worried more about COVID risk? And I think that really varies depending on the level of transmission in a particular community at any given time. So I think that is definitely one of the harder questions to answer.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned you looked at the visual smoke during stationary conditions, but not necessarily moving conditions. But a follow-up question, did you use smoke tubes to determine air movement patterns in the bus?
So we used like a smoke machine. So this was like a propylene glycol kind of smoke that we introduced into the bus. It looked like Thriller in that bus for a while when we were playing with this stuff. Yes, we definitely did. As I said, when it was stationary. We chose not to do that when we were driving for safety reasons, but when it was stationary, you could basically see the airflow pattern was, the defroster pushed air up against the window, and then it flowed back into the interior of the bus. So it kind of flowed from front to back while it was stationary. I expect you'd have a whole bunch of different turbulent airflows that you would see if you chose to do it while it was moving. And I'm not sure how helpful that would really be unless you could really do a whole lot of modeling through that particular thing. So again, we were after practical more than anything. I would love to look more closely at airflows because I think that really has an effect on the transmission as well.
Well, that kind of ties into another question is what other questions would you like to explore in the future?
I think we hadn't seen, I did a lot of work in the early 90s measuring air change rates. And there hadn't been a lot of work done since in measuring air change rates in a lot of environments. So I think it's been really interesting to look at the literature and see how many people are now thinking about measuring air change rates and how many people are doing tracer decay methods. In terms of the bus, I think we have some decent practical guidance. If we were going to do more work on a bus, it would be a lot more, technical work in terms of modeling the flows in terms of you release a particle here, where does it go sort of work, which, that's a different purpose. So I'm not sure we're going to go that direction. Really what we've been focused on now is thinking about how do some of these intervention strategies like HEPA filters and changing airflows, opening windows in classrooms. So really translating our work to the classroom and thinking about how does that affect air change rates in the classroom and air flows. So I think we've moved on to classrooms at this point, but I still think there's a lot of work to be done to think through, how do we go into these relatively low resource environments and create cost-effective solutions and have decent guidance for them, um, not only for a pandemic, but also for stuff like, wildfire smoke.
Absolutely. And do you think that there would be kind of a similar result for city buses or buses that are air conditioned? How might those be similar or different if you had
You
to
know,
guess?
ventilation systems in city buses are very different. Um, they have a more of a centralized ventilation system where you have, air exit points at various locations throughout the length of the bus. So I think it's definitely different. But the other thing that really motivated us was that there was a lot of city. We got contacted by a number of city bus operators, and they were trying to figure out, should we buy these specialized COVID disinfection devices that we could use? So it made us start to think about it. In terms of our findings, I don't think they apply very well to city buses. School buses are their own animal. Keep in mind they are utilitarian and don't have much ventilation. So it's more of a, what's the best way to do passive ventilation in a school bus?
And are there any plans to look at city buses separately or not so much?
We don't currently have a plan to look at city buses. If the opportunity arose, we would definitely think about it.
Thank you. And how do you plan on sharing this information with bus drivers? It seems more important now than ever since mask mandates have started to go away around the country.
Well, that's a good question. So, we have shared this with the folks that do make the guidance. So CDC's had this, and they've had this for a while. So some of this stuff has been incorporated into CDC guidance already. But I do think that, as this work gets published, there is an effort to really push this out a little bit more in terms of practical guidance. Theoretically, that should happen shortly. So it will be published very shortly. And I mean, we will be putting out information probably through the ERC channels more than anything else to really try to get this out nationally.
Thank you. And has the school district adopted any practices as a result of your study?
I think they have. I mean, they've definitely kind of taken to heart the message about hatches. This school district was incredibly helpful and, kind of gave us whatever we needed in order to do this testing. This wasn't an hour of their time. This was several days of their time to really do this work. So they have definitely implemented kind of minimum ventilation in these buses as we've shared our results with them.
Thank you. And would you expect to see differences in the results if all 70 to 90 passengers were in the bus, given the internal volume that all of those passengers would take up?
Maybe. Yeah, probably. I mean, you would probably see, higher air change rates, not only because of the volume that they take up, but also because of the heat that they generate. So you're going to get more convective flow inside the bus with all of that heat. So with passive ventilation, you should get a lot more, or you should get definitely a different air change rate more than anything else. But I would expect that, again, I think it would be only a higher air change rate, not a lower air change rate, would be my expectation.
Thank you.
These are great questions, though.
Yeah, thank you everyone for these questions. We also have a note that your paper will be coming out in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Hygiene in May. So
Renee must be on there. Thanks, Renee.
So yes, the paper will be coming out soon. You'll see it in May, so be sure to keep looking for that, and we can share it once it's available as well. Another question, in thinking about I noticed the impact of the hatch on the air change rates was pretty significant. And I'm also curious and kind of thinking about any suggestion of application to rideshare drivers like Uber and Lyft. If people were to open a sunroof, a window, front and back, do you think that there's some level of passive air change that would be helpful for the people in those industries?
Well, I think clearly, I think if you open the windows in cars, you're going to get kind of the same effect. It was interesting. There's been a lot more published, to be honest, on air changes in cars than there has on buses. So these kinds of tests have definitely been done. But I think you would see the same kind of thing. Definitely rolling down a window, especially a window that's away from the seat that you're sitting in, is going to help direct that air away from you and increase more dilution air.
Thank you. This one isn't exactly related to ventilation, but more of a curiosity. Do they have seatbelts on for school bus passengers that they're required to wear nowadays, if you happen to know?
They have, yes, they have seatbelts, but they are not required to wear them. And I don't think they do wear them, other than, like the ECE kind of folks, the really young kids might wear seatbelts and might be required to wear seatbelts, but normal school-age children are not required to wear seatbelts still. I think the seats are taller than they used to be too. And I think that's also a safety feature.
Awesome. And in terms of that defrost fanned noise, can you think of any mitigation opportunities for the acoustics or the noise levels of that defrost fan, or is it kind of a built-in, that's how loud it is, there isn't much of a mitigation opportunity there?
Oh, I'm relatively certain with a little bit of ingenuity, it can be mitigated, but it's definitely a whiny sound more than anything else. So it's definitely an electric motor sound, not necessarily just an airflow sound. So, I mean, these school buses they try to build them fairly inexpensively. So I don't think it has the highest quality blower motor in there.
Thank you. And a few more questions. Thank you all so much for all of the engagement here. We have so many excellent questions. We've had lots of time for the questions, so I appreciate it. Was there any sweet spots where the window opening resulted in pulling air out more than pushing air in?
Not that we could really tell. We thought about that at first, and if we had unlimited trials to do, I think what I'd like to try is more, opening a few windows at the back more than anything, to avoid blowing it in people's face, and maybe, behind the area where the heater is to really affect the temperature of the bus maybe less. But no, we weren't able to really explore that too far. We had so many configurations to test and really didn't have any answers about any of them to start with. So I think we did somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 trials in doing this. So this was not a one-day sort of thing.
Wow, quite a lot of trials and lots of variables.
Yeah, that was the problem. Too many variables and not enough time to do, tons of replicates for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Another question too, in terms of the comfort and kind of the warmth balance in the bus, was that looked at both in terms of where the driver's seats are, the children's seats are different areas of the bus? Was it kind of a consistent temperature? Were there certain areas that were warmer or cooler? Did you notice?
It was pretty consistent throughout the bus. I think the further you got away from this underseat heaters, the cooler it got. But other than that, other than being in the vicinity of one of the underseat heaters, it was pretty consistent throughout the bus.
Great. And would a rear door window or exhaust fan in the rear door improve airflow?
I don't know the answer to that. The aerodynamics of a bus, it would be great to be able to have a wind tunnel to test that to see if it would, but it's hard to say. I don't know if it's in that area where it would be sucking air out a lot better or not, depending on how the air flows over a bus. I'm pretty sure a bus was not designed with its primary intent being aerodynamics.
I might have to agree with you there. It's not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind with a school bus.
I was looking at the fuel economy of a school bus. Somehow I came across it, and it's like these things get like 8 miles to the gallon at best. So.
Wow. Well, and I guess our last question for today is, how would you word a general policy directed at districts or drivers of how to balance air changes and comfort for winter driving during a pandemic? And are you comfortable in sharing just some kind of high-level words of wisdom?
I mean, I think the key is to really share that the best bang for your buck you're going to get is by opening the roof hatches. And if you can run with the roof hatches open, that's kind of the minimum that you should do. I think really sharing the effectiveness of each of these strategies and showing some of the, it's better if you do this, not as good if you do this. And really sharing that when it's closed, you are not getting very good air exchange rate. So, I mean, I think sharing those things is most important. As this gets to our communications folks who communicate things much better than I do, I'm sure you'll start to see these things.
Thank you. Actually, we did have one more question come in. Would the air be fresher at the front?
Fresher. So I think that, one of the things that all of us have struggled with throughout the pandemic is this question of, adding a fan increases airflow and increases dilution ventilation. And I think we've all struggled with, things like creating guidance that says, well, put a fan in, but make sure it doesn't blow directly from one person onto another. And I don't think we know the answers, to be honest. I mean, I think it makes sense just from an instinctive point of view that, as air blows over people, it has more opportunities to collect whatever COVID particles might be expelled by those people. So I would say, yeah, probably the closer you are to the front, the fewer people that you're exposed to. But I don't think we know that for sure. And without really modeling that and really looking at the qualitative airflows a lot better, I don't think we have a great answer.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all the questions that came in today, and to you, Dr. Van Dyke, for both the research and also for sharing it with everyone. Thank you so much for all of these excellent questions. This presentation was recorded, and everyone who is here registered today will get a link to the recording. So you can also help spread the word if you know any bus drivers and want to recommend opening some windows. I also put a link to the webinar evaluation in the chat. You also get an email directly from Zoom tomorrow with that link to the evaluation. And once you complete the evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate with one continuing education contact hour. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you again for this presentation.
Thank you, everyone.